What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. John Krofsik and Larry Rifkin. And John, have you ever thought about, well, I'll call it the political voice? Now, this is not to suggest, as Ronald Reagan once did at a debate, I paid for this microphone, and so my political voice needs to be heard.
There you go.
No, I'm talking about the fact that I know we have one person, one vote.
Right.
Though we've not always protected that. In other words, when we have gerrymandered districts, we have made certain that certain voices all get lumped together so they have less impact. I know even in the state from which we come, we didn't have such a thing as one person, one vote until 1965. We made adjustments in the way that voting went on. Of course, in our past in this country, we've had poll taxes. We've had the inability for women to vote. Of course, African Americans. So, I mean, it's not always been one person, one vote.
I think the problem is that really, if you look at the two parties, you meet the new boss. He's the same as the old boss. To me, nothing really changes. I mean, this one will give to this, and this one will give to the businesses more, but basically, I feel we get the same crap no matter who we get.
Well,
so I don't think we have the voice.
I guess what I'm going to get us to try to think about in this podcast through a woman by the name of Lehman Schlozman is the fact that political speech is not the same one person to the next. In other words, you know people who get really involved, John. And
That's
they
true.
not only get involved by virtue of voting, that's really the simplest of the things we're asked to do in a democracy, but they actually try to organize other people. They make their voice heard. They get involved in campaigns. They put up signs and they put up stickers. They may give donations. So there are people who, by virtue of the work that they're doing, or perhaps the wealth that they have, their political speech and their voice carries a little bit louder message than some others.
I think, though, that the part of the problem we have is, and there was a good piece in the Sunday paper about this, is we're not teaching civics. We really don't know how our system works. And I think that's why we have so much division these days, because we really don't know anything about what we're supposed to do.
Well, do you think that you're as active a citizen as you'd like to be?
No, I'm definitely not. I should be more active.
And what do you consider somebody who has a lot of political speech, even more than you? Some of them willingly, and some take on a burden to go out and organize and petition and do all these hard things. You know, I'm on a commission in the town in which we live.
And I respect you for that. I mean, I think it's important to do things in your own town, and that's a good place to start.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
really that affects us primarily. Number one, more than anything that's going on federally or even statewide. Really, it's gears of government move slowly, but at least at the town level, you can see stuff happen.
Well, it's pretty shocking, though, to think that the most basic level of political speech involves going out to vote. And now we have a hard time imagining that people are going to want to do that because of ways that we limit it. But I mean, that's not the hardest thing to do to get yourself to a polling place.
I don't understand why people can't register, take the time to register to vote, and to go out and vote. Why there has to be all this magic in between? We got to have early voting. We got to have this. We got to have that. it's
Well,
just
I'm not
it's
against those
bizarre.
conventions, but I mean, when I think about it, when I think about people who are really involved and who do so many things to get their voice out there, and many of them disproportionately, I mean, we don't want certain of the people who have the loudest megaphone to have it, but we don't know what to do to take it away from them. And what's interesting about this book called Unequal and Unrepresented, Political Inequality and the People's Voice in the New Gilded Age. And Kay Schlozman is one of the authors of this. John, they've been looking at this really for 3 decades of research and a lot of information about politically active individuals and organizations, how they got that way, and how they began to understand how the levers of power do react differently to certain groups when they're organized, when they're persistent, when they have money, and when they
money talks.
right,
Ultimately,
in our
money
system.
talks.
So I think the whole message here is that as much as we all think one person, one vote in America, there are certain voices that come and rise above the others.
Absolutely.
And we're going to talk about that today on America Trends. The book is called Unequal and Unrepresented, Political Inequality and the People's Voice in the New Gilded Age. And one of the co-authors, Kay Lehman Schlozman, is with us. Kay, I find this whole concept of political voice and public voice very, very interesting, because I don't think people think about that. We think about the fact that our votes all count. We think of one man or one woman, one vote. But you say that in the political system, there are different levels of volume for different voices.
Our metaphor is quite simply that some people speak with a megaphone and some people speak in a whisper, and then there are some people who don't speak at all. There are a lot of ways that American citizens can get involved in politics and in the process let public officials know what's on their mind, what they need, what they care about, what they want the government to do or not do. Voting is the most obvious, and it's the one where we're all equal. That is, every citizen gets one, or every adult citizen gets one and only one vote per election. But there are many others. Some of them require that we make an investment of time. For example, if you go to a protest, or you send an email to your member of Congress, or you work with your neighbors on some community issue like the siting of a new school, or you work in a campaign. And some of them take money. And the most obvious one is making campaign contributions of various kinds. But we argue that another kind of, in a sense, money-based political voice is what the government hears through the organizations that represent our interests. And because most of those organizations hire professionals, often in offices either in Washington or our state capitals, to, again, tell public officials what's on our minds, more money can buy more people to do that and can buy more expertise, whether it's lawyers or public relations officials or whatever. But I just gave you a sort of an elaborated version of there are lots and lots of ways that American citizens can get involved and let public officials know what's on their mind.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of people now have a better sense of what that means, and we can all understand the premise. The question is, you say that individuals who are active, the ones who actually get involved rather than simply going to the voting booth. And believe me, Kay, it's not easy to get people even to go to the voting booth. But you're saying that those who are active in American politics are anything but representative. How so?
That's true. That is that the people who get involved are, on average, especially they're better educated, they are also more affluent. And that means that public officials are hearing from a specialized subset with often distinctive and not representative opinions.
And, you know, when we think of the term civic engagement, by most measures, it's been going down. Of course, there's another scholar out of Boston, Mr. Putnam, who wrote the book several years back, Bowling Alone. So who really is left on the political playing field to make decisions, in effect, for the rest of us?
Let me interject to say that when Bob Putnam documented that civic engagement was going down, he was absolutely correct. It does seem to have leveled off. So he was observing an important trend that does seem to have leveled off. The people who are left are, as I say, people who, in the terms of social scientists, would say have higher socioeconomic status. They have better education, higher incomes, and jobs that demand of them what we call civic skills, that they make presentations, that they communicate all the time, that they organize things, and so on. Different kinds of the exercise of political voice require different kinds of resources for doing it. So the educated are better represented when it comes to voting. But when it comes to voters, another thing that really matters is just how interested are you in politics. When it comes to, for example, getting in touch with a public official, again, often education is key because it's just easier for people who are used to communicating, and they have a computer and they use it in their jobs. It's easier to get in touch with a public official. In contrast, protest is sometimes the political resource of people with more limited educational and income resources. But the one thing that we found over and over again is that there's only one variable that drives who makes campaign donations, and in particular, who makes big ones, and that is the size of your bank account. That higher levels of income are very strongly related to making campaign donations, and obviously in an era where people are able to make huge campaign donations, the level of your affluence is a huge driver.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think every cycle, and by the way, there are so many interesting questions that go into the weight in addition to the volume of political speech. And I go back to campaigns where we've all argued about campaign finance. And in the state that we come from, we have a public financing mechanism. Many states do not. And we just lost John McCain. And many of us remember the McCain-Feingold bill. And money, money, money. And John McCain was determined after, I think, the Keating Five that he was going to try to make some reforms. So I think a lot of people would be listening to this saying, well, have we made any reforms, or have they all been mitigated by, say, subsequent Supreme Court rulings like Citizens United? If you could give us a thumbnail of money and its influence in the system.
Well, there are two questions. Where does the money come from, and how much difference does it make? And we're pretty sure about the former, and we're less sure about the latter. So it's very unambiguous that the money comes very disproportionately from affluent people. And the Sunlight Foundation had this wonderful statistic in 2012 and 2014 that showed that between a quarter and a third of all campaign donations that were registered, and there's other ways to give money that are called dark money that don't get registered, but the federal donations that were listed in that way, that between a quarter and a third of them came from what the Sunlight Foundation called the 1% of the 1%, which is the top 10,000th of Americans. It's a group that doesn't even fill the football stadium of the university for which I work. So that there's a lot of money coming from very deep pockets. How much difference it makes is a more contested. I think that we aren't really sure exactly how much difference it makes when you give a donation, but certainly if those donations vastly overrepresent the affluent, that does mean a much more limited voice for not just economically disadvantaged people, but even for just ordinary middle-class people. In terms of the ebb and flow of campaign finance regulations, we did some serious regulating in the early 1970s in the aftermath of Watergate, which is remembered by some people and at least by the history books in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. There was reform. The Supreme Court reined it in a decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, in 1976, at least at the federal level. There have been state initiatives, and we can talk about those. But the next big reform was McCain-Feingold, which was in the early 2000s, 2003, I think, but I'm not sure. And then the Supreme Court put its imprimatur on that decision. But then later on, the federal courts, and it's not just the Supreme Court, have issued a series of decisions about campaign finance. And the one that we know most about is Citizens United. But it is part of a series of decisions. And at the time it was decided, Citizens United, there was a focus on can corporations give money? And that was what people got exercised about. And in fact, corporations have not swooped in and made a lot of donations. But the real impact of Citizens United and other decisions, not all of them Supreme Court, and a very important one is called Speech Now, and that was a federal court, not a speech. It was the D.C. Court of Appeals, not the Supreme Court. It was a 2010 decision. But what that has done is to define giving money as a form of speech with First Amendment protection. And that means that it's very hard under that principle to limit the amount that affluent people can give as campaign donations in federal elections.
It seems so hard to me to know who has entered the debate arena in many cases, because many of the groups that I hear or see as funding various messages obfuscate their real intent. So we'll see something like Citizens for Prosperity or the Association for Better Government. What about more transparency? We don't know who these PACs are in many cases.
That's true, and a lot of them have generic names, and a lot of the generic names are somewhat misleading. You know that when you hear an ad from a federal candidate, you now hear, I'm Barack Obama, and I sanction this message, or whatever the boilerplate is. But there's lots of speech lots of speech that's paid for by organizations is less. It's less easy to know where is it coming from. I do think more transparency will help, but I also think that there's so many donations and so much data that it's really hard for ordinary people to get their arms around, and even the media, who are very helpful. There's just so much data that you can't make sense of it in real time to be useful in making voting decisions. So I certainly subscribe to transparency, but I don't think it's a cure-all.
But is there a move afoot for more of it? And I would think that it would have great impact on state races in many cases. I know in our state, there was a state representative campaign where some of that money came in very late in the process and seemingly affected the outcome.
That's true. And one of the things about money that comes in late is that it's very hard to get the word out and get it processed that quickly, the information that quickly as to where it's coming from. So you raise an important question.
When we talked about one man or one woman and one vote, what about, there's so many elements that impact the process. And I said when I was doing a radio program often that the politicians pick us before we pick them. So there's been so much gerrymandering, and they know what they're trying to do in terms of slicing and dicing the various districts. And that's why it's pretty remarkable that the Democrats think they have an opportunity to win before the 2020 census, because the GOP was so successful in taking that census and building these districts that are favorable to them. What do you think about that impact on the quality and the forcefulness of speech when, in fact, we see the way these districts are built?
To step back and to put it under an even broader umbrella, I always tell students when I teach parties and elections that if there's a battle about procedures and democratic principles, always look and see whose ox is being gored and figure out the political rules are never neutral in their political effects. And gerrymandering or the drawing of districts is one very good example. the 2010 elections were absolutely crucial. It was a major sweep for the Republicans after the 2008 elections that brought us unified government at the national level among Democrats, and the Republicans began taking state houses. And after the 2010 census, they had, when they dominated the state house and the state governorships, the right, depending on the rules in the particular state, to draw districts that can be favorable to one party or another. Another thing is that our political geography has shifted, that there are fewer and fewer competitive states. And at least in presidential elections, as we know, because we've had two elections in the last 2 decades in which a partisan plurality for the Democrats was not translated into a Democratic presidency, and part of that reflects the fact that there are a number of relatively small states are dominated by Republicans, and relatively small states' electoral votes, there are fewer popular votes behind every electoral vote in a small state.
You say in your book that disparities in political voice across different segments are so great that it calls into question the notion of equal consideration by decision makers. And if there is a statement that should really concern people, it's the fact that policymaking is now in the hands of those who already have a lot of the toys and a lot of the resources in our society. And you're suggesting that by virtue of the power of certain voices and the diminished nature of others, that in fact decisions are really won by those who have the voice.
There are lots of factors that impact what public officials hear, and it's not just what they hear through the media that I've just been talking about, whether it's the impact of votes, which of course puts them in place, or what they hear through, the emails they get, or what they hear from community groups and so on, or their campaign contributions they collect and so forth. We are not arguing that the U.S. is a plutocracy. They have lots of other ways to hear about people's preferences. They hear
like
about
public
them through
polling.
The media, and the media are not dominated by one party or the other, as we know. The media have gotten more partisan, as they say. If you're listening to MSNBC, you're a liberal. If you're listening to Fox News, you're a conservative. And if you're listening to CNN, you're planes late and you're in an airport. But so the media do give us, if not balanced perspectives, at least alternative perspectives. Public opinion polls, when conducted correctly, can tell public officials important information. So political voice that we talk about is not the only way public officials hear from citizens or hear about what citizens are thinking. The other thing I want to say is that the especially well-educated people who are disproportionately represented in what we call political voice are not uniform in their opinions. In fact, big campaign money goes both to Democrats and to Republicans. So I don't want to say that there is a thin, especially affluent slice of Americans that is dominating policy outcomes, that's all in agreement with one another and is just feathering its own nest.
But how do we amp up the voices of the poor and the dispossessed when the megaphones of the privileged are so powerful?
That for us is a $64,000 question. And, we've thought about that from so many perspectives. And unfortunately, we more or less conclude that in our current era of partisan polarization and intense rhetoric on either side and not enough reaching across of aisles and so on, that given that political configuration, along with the judicial interpretations of using money as a form of speech, for us the bottom line is that anything that would really equalize political voice in an important way is either politically infeasible or constitutionally proscribed, and that anything that might happen politically and be acceptable constitutionally wouldn't make much difference. We're not so optimistic.
But what about people just getting more active? You said, when I mentioned Robert Putnam's work, that in fact civic engagement is at least stable at this point. We're also hearing that there's a groundswell of regular people getting into politics, teachers and others, scientists, and either running or volunteering. Do you sense that this is a moment in time when people may have been frustrated at the results in the past and have decided to get off the sidelines? And what impact do you think that will have?
We certainly know that there have been periodic times of public fervor in the United States and pushing by ordinary people on governments and other kinds of institutions for change. And we may be in one of those situations now. And we can think of the times that it happened, the 1930s, the 1960s. People thought we were due for that kind of upsurge of fervor in maybe the 1990s, and it didn't happen, and it may be happening now. We certainly know that there have been massive protests on a variety of subjects in the last couple of years, and we also know that there are local efforts, Indivisible and Resistance and so forth, that are bringing ordinary people into politics. I have to say that, on the other hand, the two examples you gave, teachers, first of all, they're quite well educated, and many of the teachers who are involved have unions. And unions have traditionally been a way of bringing together ordinary people and giving them, by virtue of their numbers rather than their deep resources, a voice not only at the table in their workplace, but also in politics. We know also that the union movement has been kind of kicked in the butt. Currently, only 6% of private sector workers are members of unions, down from over a third in the 1950s. The proportion of public sector workers who are unionized has stayed stable in the low 30s. As far as scientists, the other example you gave, those are the quintessential kinds of people that we have found are always active. For all of us, political activity is a somewhat intermittent form of involvement. It's not that we're all writing letters or going to protests or campaigning for candidates every minute of every day. But there has been an overrepresentation of exactly the kinds of people who you mentioned scientists. These are very well-educated people who know how to communicate their wishes, are used to doing it, and so on. In the early 2000s, in the aftermath of what was something of an administrative mess of the 2000 election, which pitted the victorious George W. Bush against Al Gore, that there were in Florida a lot of administrative problems with the way the election was carried out. And so the Help America Vote Act was legislated, and it gave money to states and localities to upgrade how they administered elections. And a lot of places opted for systems that were based on digital technologies rather than old-fashioned paper. And there was an upsurge among technical experts with, computer engineers and so forth saying, these could be hacked. This is still an issue, by the way. And we need a paper trail. And a lot of states and localities, including the one I live in here in Massachusetts, went back to some form of paper. But that was an example of how scientists know how to get involved. I'm more worried about the person who's cleaning your office, the person who's checking out your groceries. Their voices are less likely to be heard.
What about some of the reforms like early voting, same-day registration? What mechanisms are you as political scientists going to use to measure whether people are more involved, whether their forms of speech, whatever they're doing, volunteering in ways perhaps that don't involve money, are beginning to have an impact such that there is greater representation and somewhat of a more equal playing field, politically speaking?
Okay. I'm going to do my ER routine again, which is that such things as early voting and this is not my research, but research by other political scientists, the sounding suggests that what it does is make it easier for people who would have trouble getting to the polls to vote. People like my elderly parents who were in their 90s. They would have voted anyway, but it was a lot easier for my mom to get my dad to vote early in town hall when he was in his wheelchair and so on. And what the studies have shown so far is that early voting draws to the polls more people like people who would already vote. And they haven't really democratized the electorate in the sense of bringing in less well-educated people, less politically interested people, who are underrepresented among voters. Same-day registration expands the electorate. That is the one reform that expands who votes. It's less clear, again, that it's bringing in a more diverse electorate.
In closing, we are told that our congressmen and senators are spending about 50% of their time across the street from their office raising money. Who are they talking to on those phone lines, and what is the impact of those conversations and the money that is transferred to those politicians as it relates to how the process really works?
Again, I'm a little more leery of saying that I really understand what difference it makes, but I do know that those calls in the call centers that each of the parties has, senators and reps can't do from their offices, from their regular offices. Senator Murphy from Connecticut talked about being in the call center and calling and getting a lot of questions from the investment bankers. He's from Connecticut, a state with a lot of financial services as part of the base, from the venture capital people and so forth, about issues like Dodd-Frank, the legislation in the aftermath of the recession of 07, 08 that put some regulations on financial institutions and so on. And as Chris Murphy said, he was hearing a lot of very technical questions about Dodd-Frank. And he said something to the effect of, believe me, those aren't the questions I get when I'm campaigning at the supermarket.
I hear you. Unequal and Unrepresented, Political Inequality, and the People's Voice in the New Gilded Age. Lehman Schlozman has been with us. She co-authored the book with Henry Brady and Sidney Verba. I thank you so much for joining us today, Kay, on America Trends.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.